Do you know how much $2.3 trillion really is? How could that amount just disappear from the Pentagon's books the day before 9/11? Today, we're going to dive into the chilling story of the missing trillions, the shadowy accounting, and the questions that still remain unanswered. On the morning of September 10, 2001, inside the press briefing room of the Pentagon, U.S. Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld stood before the cameras and delivered a stunning admission. With little fanfare and no urgency in his tone, he stated that the Department of Defense could not account for approximately $2.3 trillion in transactions. The American public, already accustomed to government waste, barely noticed the figure. The news cycle moved on quickly, and few grasped the scale of what had just been confessed. This wasn't an over-budget line item or a misplaced spreadsheet. This was nearly 1/4 of the federal budget, vanished without documentation, transparency, or consequence. Behind the scenes, a small network of auditors and financial analysts within the Pentagon had been working tirelessly to trace these missing funds. They were buried deep in outdated systems, buried deeper still under layers of bureaucracy, shell companies, and black budget operations. Some of those investigators were stationed inside the Pentagon's West Wing, specifically the newly renovated wedge housing the Office of Naval Intelligence and the Defense Financial Accounting Service. It was here that the documentation trail ended and where the human knowledge of that financial black hole was stored. 24 hours later, that exact section of the Pentagon would be obliterated. At 9:37 a.m. on September 11, 2001, American Airlines Flight 77 struck the western facade, carving through rings of concrete and steel. The precise point of impact aligned with the very offices responsible for tracing the Defense Department's financial discrepancies. Dozens of lives were lost. Critical records were destroyed. And the investigation into the trillion, already complicated, died in the flames and rubble. The tragedy of 9/11's rightly dominated headlines, eclipsing every other story. The missing trillions were forgotten almost overnight, reduced to a footnote in a nation's grief. But for those who dared to look back, to trace the timeline, the proximity of that financial revelation to the most devastating attack on American soil raised unsettling questions. In a nation where war, secrecy, and money often intertwine in the shadows, was it merely coincidence that the paper trail disappeared just as the towers fell? Or was this the moment when history buried its most damning secret under a cloud of smoke and silence? Where is the money? The Pentagon's inability to account for $2.3 trillion was not the result of a single error or isolated miscalculation. It was the byproduct of a vast and deeply flawed financial system that had operated unchecked for decades. Within the Department of Defense, accounting was not just outdated, it was functionally broken. Thousands of financial systems existed across various branches and departments, many of them incompatible with one another, lacking centralized oversight or even standardized bookkeeping. Transactions were logged manually, records were incomplete or duplicated, and entire categories of spending were labeled as unsupported adjustments, meaning no source documents could be found to explain them. Auditors working within the Office of the Inspector General had already begun raising concerns in the late 1990s. They discovered that billions in expenses were being logged without proper documentation. In some cases, money was spent before it was even budgeted. Entire contracts were paid out with no receipts, no services rendered, and no clear accountability. Despite repeated warnings, no meaningful reform came. In one report from 2000, Pentagon officials admitted that they could not track $1.1 trillion in bookkeeping entries. A year later, that number had more than doubled. For the average taxpayer, numbers like these are incomprehensible. The scale of the money involved is so vast that it detaches from reality. But inside the military-industrial complex, such figures were not treated as alarming. They were business as usual. Defense budgets passed through Congress with minimal scrutiny, often bundled with emergency spending authorizations or buried in thousands of pages of legislative text. Black budget programs, authorized under classified provisions, allowed billions more to move invisibly through secret programs with no public oversight. In interviews years later, retired officials and former auditors described a culture of apathy and deliberate obfuscation. They spoke of contracts awarded without bidding, of third-party contractors who operated in legal gray zones, and of files that were deliberately mislabeled or destroyed. One senior analyst recalled that certain data trails just ended, as though someone had intentionally severed them. The technology used to track defense spending was decades out of date. Some systems still ran on COBOL, a computer language developed in the 1950s. Integration was impossible, visibility limited. While the Defense Department claimed at the time that the missing $2.3 trillion was not lost, but simply untracked, there was no reliable way to prove it. Without documentation, without a clear audit trail, and with key offices struggling under bureaucratic paralysis, the money may as well have vanished. And then, just as the story began to crack open, just as investigators began pulling at the edges of a vast financial web, it was all swept away in a single moment of unimaginable destruction. At precisely 9:37 a.m. on September 11, 2001, American Airlines Flight 77 descended rapidly over Arlington, Virginia, and slammed into the western side of the Pentagon. Traveling at over 500 miles per hour, the Boeing 757 tore through the outer wall and penetrated deep into the structure, igniting jet fuel and setting off an inferno that would rage for hours. The impact carved a path through 3 of the building's 5 concentric rings, destroying newly reinforced offices and killing 125 people inside the Pentagon, in addition to the 59 passengers and crew aboard the flight. In a building that spans over 6 million square feet, the odds of hitting any single department might seem random. But the section struck that morning was not just any corridor. It was home to the Pentagon's budget analysts, accountants, and members of the Office of Naval Intelligence. Among those lost were a number of civilian and military personnel who had been directly involved in investigating financial discrepancies within the Department of Defense. They were part of the very team responsible for uncovering and tracing the unaccounted $2.3 trillion that had been publicly acknowledged just one day prior. This part of the Pentagon, known as Wedge 1, had recently undergone an extensive renovation. Ironically, the upgrades included reinforced steel and Kevlar mesh walls intended to protect against bomb blasts. These modifications likely saved lives, but they also concentrated destruction in a specific area, creating a funnel of devastation directly through the heart of the accounting and finance divisions. The firestorm obliterated paper files, backup systems, and physical servers. Whatever digital trail might have remained to explain the missing money was reduced to ash and molten plastic. In the days and weeks that followed, officials insisted that the location of the strike was coincidental. The narrative focused, understandably, on the horror of the attacks, the thousands of lives lost, and the need for justice and national unity. Few in the media asked about the destroyed records. Fewer still followed up on the financial disclosure from September 10th. The questions disappeared as quickly as the documents themselves, and yet, to those who understood the layout of the Pentagon and the nature of its internal divisions, the impact zone stood out. It was not the most visible or symbolically significant part of the building. It was not the command center or the Joint Chiefs' secure bunker. It was the financial nerve center, modest in appearance, but central to unraveling years of mismanagement, fraud, and hidden expenditures. Whether by design or by tragic chance, the plane struck the only section of the Pentagon that held the most critical clues to the Defense Department's lost trillions. In the official record, the strike was attributed to al-Qaeda hijackers operating under the larger plan to cripple America's symbols of power. But to investigators and skeptics alike, the precision of that impact zone raised a question that remains deeply unsettling. Was the plane drawn to the Pentagon's financial offices by fate? Or was there something more calculated beneath the surface? In a war where truth became a casualty, this unanswered question remains buried beneath concrete, flame-scorched walls, and the silence that followed. In the aftermath of the September 11th attacks, the world's attention turned toward the smoking ruins of the World Trade Center and the rising drumbeat of war in Afghanistan. Within days, the American government launched the largest military mobilization since World War II, and with it, a renewed sense of patriotic unity that left little room for dissent or deeper inquiry. But beneath the wave of national mourning and resolve, a quieter, more uncomfortable question began to surface in hushed corners of the internet, fringe publications, and among a few skeptical journalists. Was the destruction of the Pentagon's financial offices, just one day after the public disclosure of $2.3 trillion in missing funds, truly a coincidence? For some, the timing was simply too precise. The admission of the missing trillions had been largely ignored on September 10th, but to those paying attention, it represented one of the most serious accounting failures in U.S. history. That the very next morning, the small group of analysts tasked with investigating the shortfall were among the first to die in the attacks raised suspicion, if not outright alarm. The exact location of the Pentagon impact, Wedge 1, recently renovated and housing key financial personnel, seemed almost surgical in nature. No warning had been given, no files relocated, no backups ensured. In a building as vast and secure as the Pentagon, how could the nation's financial record keepers have been so vulnerable? The government's response to these suspicions was swift and categorical. Officials insisted that the flight path of American Airlines 77 was not aimed with such precision. According to the official narrative, the hijackers had little aviation training and simply managed to strike the building's west side by chance. Skeptics were dismissed as conspiracy theorists, their questions lumped in with more outlandish claims about missiles, inside jobs, and orchestrated demolition. The mainstream media, still reeling from the attacks, offered little space for critical inquiry. Any attempt to connect the financial revelations to the events of 9/11 was seen as opportunistic or disrespectful. Still, the questions persisted. The Rumsfeld announcement was real. The $2.3 trillion figure was not invented. The audit failures were documented in official reports. The offices destroyed were indeed involved in the accounting review. And in the years that followed, as more details emerged about government secrecy, clandestine operations, and intelligence failures, the suspicion that 9/11 may have served multiple purposes only deepened. Some argued that the attacks, while carried out by foreign terrorists, provided the perfect smokescreen for burying domestic failures, financial, operational, and ethical. Others went further, proposing that rogue elements within the national security apparatus may have allowed the attack to occur, or even shaped its target, for reasons far beyond retaliation or ideology. In this view, 9/11 was not just a tragedy, but an opportunity to reset the narrative, to initiate global war, and to erase inconvenient truths with fire and rubble. Whether one subscribes to these theories or not, the questions remain unanswered. No comprehensive audit of the missing trillions was ever completed. No independent investigation was launched into the financial impact of the Pentagon strike. The offices lost were never fully rebuilt in the same form. And the American public, consumed by grief and war, never looked back. In that silence, the truth, whatever it may be, was buried, not by conspiracy perhaps, but by design. A tragedy of convenience, resting at the uneasy intersection of coincidence and consequence. The disappearance of $2.3 trillion was only the beginning of a continuing crisis that has plagued the Department of Defense for decades. After 9/11, as the United States plunged into wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, financial mismanagement deepened amid the chaos. Billions of dollars in cash were flown into conflict zones in untraceable pallets, often vanishing without explanation. Over $6 billion alone disappeared during the Iraq War, lost amid corruption, poor oversight, and the fog of war. Contractors like Halliburton faced fraud accusations but escaped meaningful punishment, exemplifying a broader culture of impunity. Efforts to bring accountability have repeatedly failed. The Pentagon's first full audit in 2018 revealed a staggering $21 trillion in unaccounted adjustments, numbers that underscore systemic fiscal chaos rather than isolated mistakes. Meanwhile, the government's classified black budget has grown to over $60 billion annually by 2023, shielded behind layers of secrecy that keep both Congress and the public in the dark. These funds flow into intelligence, special operations, and experimental programs, making independent oversight nearly impossible. Whistleblowers who have tried to expose this financial rot have often been silenced or punished. Analysts revealing wasteful spending in Afghanistan were jailed, and auditors questioning lucrative defense contracts faced sudden reassignments. This active suppression discourages transparency and perpetuates a system where secrecy enables waste and abuse. Major media outlets have also played a role by burying important follow-ups on these scandals, allowing public scrutiny to fade. The consequences for democracy are profound. A 2023 Pew poll found that 72% of Americans believe the government hides financial crimes, reflecting widespread erosion of trust. This mistrust is not born of conspiracy theories, but of repeated failures to provide transparency and accountability. The real issue is a system where secrecy equals impunity, where trillions can vanish, offices can be destroyed, and no one is held responsible. The timeline of missing money is a grim roadmap. The 2001 announcement of missing trillions, followed by the Pentagon attack, $6 billion vanishing in Iraq in 2003, the colossal 2018 audit failure, and the unchecked black budget of today. This pattern reveals a government where financial mismanagement thrives beneath the cover of war and national security. Ultimately, this crisis is not just about lost dollars, but about a deeper erosion of trust and democratic accountability. The vanished trillions represent a failure to safeguard public resources and uphold the principles of transparent governance. In the silence that follows, the unanswered questions remain, urging continued vigilance and scrutiny. The cost of secrecy may well be measured not just in money, but in the very trust that binds a government to its people. Now that you have seen the facts, what do you think? Can trillions of taxpayer dollars really vanish without consequence? Or are we looking at something deeper, more deliberate? Do you believe this is just government incompetence? Or a cover-up hiding in plain sight? We want to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below, share this video, and help keep the pressure on for transparency and accountability. Because if we don't ask the hard questions, who will? If you've made it this far, it means you're enjoying the story. If you're interested in more, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss a great story. This is Liam. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.